Ladies and gentlemen, in part one of this lecture, we reviewed the evidence of the master conspiracy to rule the world from its origin in the Order of the Illuminati in Bavaria in 1776 up through the subversive experiment it engaged in called the French Revolution in 1789 and into the 19th century, the campaigns for German and Italian unification and the birth of the Marxian socialist movement. In the second part of our lecture, we're going to see how this movement spread itself in the 19th century most destructively into the new and rising American Republic. We're also going to review the progress into the 20th century of fomenting world wars as an excuse for world government and subsequent problems and patterns and trends in foreign policy, as well as look at solutions to dealing with this conspiracy. Early contact with French Illuminized Grand Orient Freemasonry occurred between leaders of the new American Republic during the period of the Articles of Confederation, immediately or within a few years after the achievement of American independence. American ambassadors to France, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, as Freemasons themselves and as dignitaries, were welcomed into the French lodges and entertained by its leaders and members. They came in contact with the influence of the Illuminati on a very high level at that time in France. In the United States, George Washington, our first president, was a Freemason himself and was very much aware of the conspiratorial influence of the Illuminati within continental European Freemasonic lodges. Fortunately, American and British lodges were spared this infiltration and misuse. In the last year of his life, 1798 to 1799, President Washington, in retirement, received and read a copy of John Robeson's very important book, Proofs of a Conspiracy. And having read that book and already aware of the destructive influence of the Illuminati in France, he wrote to Reverend G.W. Snyder, "I have heard much of the nefarious and dangerous plan and doctrines of the Illuminati, but never saw the book until you were pleased to send it to me." He goes on in that correspondence to explain that although he's aware of the influence of the Illuminati in France, he was comforted to know that they had not been successful in infiltrating American Freemasonry, which of course was the case. He was very much aware of their attempts to do so because 5 years earlier, during his administration, a rebellion, an insurrection took place in the western counties of Pennsylvania, which had nothing to do with taxes on spirits, but has come to be called the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was an attempt to foment secession and insurrection, which was very difficult to put down. It was masterfully handled by President Washington. It cost our government $1 million to raise the troops, to manifest a physical presence to put down this rebellion without any loss of life. But as a result of investigating the Whiskey Rebellion, President Washington found out that it had been fomented and organized by representatives of the French government, principally Edmond Charles Genet and his successor after he was recalled back to France at the request of President Washington, Monsieur Fauchet. They had organized and assisted the formation of so-called democratic societies in that part of Pennsylvania, and these had led to the revolt. In a letter that George Washington wrote in August of 1794, he referred to the Whiskey Rebellion and said, quote, "I consider this insurrection as the first formidable fruit of the democratic societies, brought forth, I believe, too prematurely for their own views, which may contribute to the annihilation of them. That these societies were instituted by the artful and designing members, many of their body I have no doubt mean well, but know very little of the real plan, primarily to sow the seeds of jealousy and distrust among the people of the government by destroying all confidence in the administration of it, and that these doctrines have been budding and blowing ever since, is not new to anyone who is acquainted with the characters of their leaders and has been attentive to their maneuvers." In another letter about the same time, President Washington said to John Jay that the self-created societies which have spread themselves over this country have been laboring incessantly to sow seeds of distrust, jealousy, and of course discontent, thereby hoping to effect some revolution in the government, is not unknown to you. That they have been the fomenters of the Western disturbances admits of no doubt in the mind of anyone who will examine their conduct. But fortunately, they have precipitated a crisis for which they were not prepared, and thereby have unfolded views which will, I trust, effectuate their annihilation sooner than it might otherwise have happened. At the same time that it has afforded an occasion for the people of this country to show their abhorrence of the result and their attachment to the Constitution and the laws, for I believe that 5 times the number of militia that was required would have come forward if it had been necessary in support of them," unquote. And it was the fact that President Washington, although he had interference from prominent people around him, came out very firmly against this rebellion, and there was so much public support for his initiative that it literally failed. An additional source of information at this time that was most important was a book published at the turn of the century by Reverend Seth Payson, Proof of the Real Existence and Dangerous Tendency of Illuminism. This provided an abstract or summary of the works of Robeson and Barruel, and also traced the formation of the Illuminist lodges by French agents in the new American states on the eastern seaboard. A number of lodges from New England to Virginia. Another much more recent source on this period by liberal historian Vernon Stauffer, New England and the Bavarian Illuminati, underscores the fact that the leading clergymen, civic officials, educators, presidents of Yale and Harvard University, and the leading author of American history and geography textbooks, the father of Samuel F.B. Morse, Jedediah Morse, who was in many ways the national chaplain of the United States at that time, who delivered the National Fast Day or Thanksgiving sermon in Congress. Jedediah Morse was one of the leading expositors warning the American people about the influence and spread of the Illuminati in the United States. So it was very well known as a result of distribution of Robeson's works and other secondary writings, very well understood, and that's why the Illuminati literally failed to bring to our shores the revolution they had fomented in France in 1789. However, the activity of the Illuminized lodges that were formed from New England to Virginia continued. This book, written by John Wood, documented in some detail the activities in New York State of the Theistic Society, or the Columbian Illuminati, a branch of the Illuminati, a system of lodges there that came under the political control and direction of the Clinton family in New York State, out of which Governor DeWitt Clinton emerged. And it was among this New York faction of budding Illuminists and sympathizers with the French Revolution that one very expedient politician, very reminiscent of politicians of much more recent vintage in the United States, emerged, who would place himself at the disposal of any European sponsors, any supporters who would help him rise to power, even at the cost of fomenting a secession or rebellion in the United States that would destroy the American Republic. He was unsuccessful in doing so, but he tried very hard. His name was Aaron Burr. And by 1805, he had begun to arm private mercenaries along the Mississippi River and set up military encampments, hoping that he would receive military support through Mexico from France or Spain. At this time, Napoleon Bonaparte was far too embroiled in his conflicts and battles in Europe and holding on to his empire to give assistance to this foreign satellite project. Also, the expected support that Burr was welcoming from Spain failed to materialize. So by 1805 to 1807, Burr's plot, his attempt to create a rebellion and a secession movement, was exposed, it was prosecuted, and he was put on trial. Other indications of the concern over the spread of the Illuminati in the United States focused on the incident in 1826 when a man in Batavia, New York, William Morgan, published a book exposing the rituals and practices of Freemasonry. And it's interesting that within a very brief time of the publication of Morgan's book, apparently a British Illuminist was sent to the United States, and Morgan was taken out, apprehended, kidnapped, and executed. Now, it's very unclear what William Morgan may have been planning to expose at the time he was killed. The book he managed to publish is not a significant revelation. but he was a member of and working within the circles of lodges in New York State that were Illuminized, so he may have posed a potential threat to the Illuminati acting in New York lodges by threatening to expose their political and subversive activities. We'll never know the answer to that because he was killed. As a result of his murder, the anti-Masonic party and anti-Masonic movement formed, and within 10 years of Morgan's murder, the party had conducted or held its first presidential candidacy and had actually conducted, interestingly enough, the first nominating convention of any political party in the United States. The anti-Masonic movement probably had one constructive effect, and that was to alarm a sufficient number of citizens and Freemasons to make sure that any French Illuminist influence was purged from American Freemasonry at that time and subsequently. The various attempts to create secession and spread rebellion continued, and the most significant of them, with strong affiliation to the Illuminist activity in Europe in the first, second, and third decades of the 19th century, was an organization formed in the 1830s in South Carolina called Young America. In this picture, you see several gentlemen, six in fact, who belonged to Young America. The one seated in the middle was the leader of Young America, George Nicholas Sanders, an incredible political kingmaker and insider from Kentucky, who directed this organization as an official American branch of the European network of the Carbonari, which was being directed at this time by Buonarroti and Mazzini. The purpose of Young America was primarily this goal. They wanted to expand then American territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean, all the way south through Texas, through Mexico, and into Central America. They wanted to build an empire there, have American territory established, have any other foreign colonial power removed from the area, and create, in effect, a huge geographical vacuum. An American empire which could not be governed by the American government and its military power predominantly residing on the East Coast. They hoped at that point they would be able to have allied military forces brought in from Europe, either through Canada or Mexico, and use this vast new annexed territory as a beachhead for launching an assault on the East Coast, and with the help of their Illuminist European colleagues and supporters, reconquer the North American continent. So they pushed very mightily during the 1830s and 1840s for expansion of American territory with slavery westward and southward. But they began to run into opposition from various presidential administrations, particularly beginning in the 1840s. By 1855 to 1859, it was obvious that the plan of Young America to expand American territory so drastically in the Western Hemisphere was not going to be administered as official U.S. government policy, so they had to change their strategy. They formed an underground military organization, a paramilitary structure called the Knights of the Golden Circle. The purpose of the Knights of the Golden Circle, instead of being able to expand American territory and create this geographical vacuum and beachhead for foreign military invasion, they decided that what they would do is break off a portion of the existing United States, form a separate confederacy at war with the Union, with the American government, and the remaining, what was left of the United States. They had to do this by setting up secession movements in Texas, South Carolina, Virginia, and movements which would campaign for independence from the United States government. The principal activity was organized in Texas in 1859 to 1860, although it gave impetus to Allied activity on the parts of members of the Knights of the Golden Circle, principally in South Carolina and Virginia. This activity of the Knights of the Golden Circle was directed by a man who called himself General George Bickley, the leader of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And it's significant that in Texas in 1859, the Illuminist affiliated Knights of the Golden Circle organized the political campaigns and campaigns of intimidation and pressure so well that in the vote for independence from the Union, there was not a single vote registered for affiliation with the United States at that time, and very little votes registered in the 1860 election for President Lincoln. A tremendous amount of tremendous campaign of pressure and intimidation was waged by the Knights of the Golden Circle to encourage Texas to declare its independence and to start, in effect, the drive for the Confederacy in that part of the country. One of the eyewitnesses to these events in Texas at that time referred to the Knights of the Golden Circle as, quote, the secessionists proper. Their history is the history of secession from a small and insignificant band of kidnappers and filibusterers. They have gradually increased their numbers until they are to be counted by the thousands in the southern states of the Union and by dozens in the border free states. They are the most dangerous of enemies, unquote. And they were literally responsible for creating the Southern Confederacy, its government, its movement, artificially and arbitrarily imposing it on the unhappy people of the South and trying very hard to make an independent Confederacy active in the state of Texas. It was unsuccessful because President Lincoln became aware of this conspiracy. In 1861, there was an attempt by the Knights of the Golden Circle to blow up a railroad train on which the president was traveling near Baltimore. And at that time, he became aware of the problem and directed the then recently formed Secret Service, which had been concerning itself primarily with money counterfeiting and other types of crimes, direct the Secret Service into infiltrating this organization, so President Lincoln was able to find out all about it. And of course, through very strong and somewhat ruthless measures that he took, he was able to preserve the Union against this organized rebellion that was aimed at destroying the American Republic. The one thing the Illuminati and its agents and the Knights of the Golden Circle could do in response to that was bring personal vengeance against the American president, who, very much like President Washington, under similar circumstances, had prevented their destruction of our nation. And it is very clear that they were the organizers and directors of his assassination. In the 1930s, Azola Forrester, the granddaughter of John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln, went to the War Department archives in Washington and examined the personal effects and property of her grandfather at the time of his apprehension and death. She found a number of insignia and recognizable identification badges and identification as a member or agent of the Knights of the Golden Circle. The evidence she collected led her to the conclusion expressed in her book that her grandfather's role in the assassination of President Lincoln was carried out acting as an agent of the Knights of the Golden Circle. In addition to the attempt to destroy the United States by establishing one confederacy, the Knights of the Golden Circle tried to establish a number of other ones. There was an attempt to take several of the now northern Midwestern states, which were then the northwestern states of Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and break this away and form a so-called Northwestern Confederacy. A very interesting book which was published and widely distributed and is easily found in used bookstores is James Horan's Confederate Agent. And if you keep in mind that the book concerns itself primarily with the campaign to establish the Northwestern Confederacy, you'll still find this book to be readily accessible and one of the best case histories of this period, as long as you're able to keep it in context with the continuity that we've been presenting. Other sources of interest about this period, which documented the role of the Knights of the Golden Circle, both in bringing on, establishing the Confederacy, necessitating the winning of the War of the Rebellion, as Lincoln called it, and also their responsibility for Lincoln's assassination, were the personal accounts of Secret Service agents like Felix Steger, Winslow Iyer, and other books, both contemporarily published right after the war, Orville Victor's History of American Conspiracies, and there are a number of later essays like Albert Benton's review of the Copperhead movement, the defeatist peace Democrat movement in the northern Midwestern states, the book called The Movement for Peace Without Victory During the Civil War. It's interesting that there was a strong attempt to make the state of California after 1850 and the Oregon and Washington territories into a Pacific Coast Federation of States. And we read in articles in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly of the involvement of early California politicians in this movement, some of whom hoped to, like Aaron Burr decades before them, rule over a new imperial dominion. After President Lincoln's defeat of the rebellion brought on by leaders of the Knights of the Golden Circle, some of these principal conspirators escaped to Mexico, where they established residence following the war and had a safe harbor for their own protection. One of the most interesting accounts published on this period was the work of John Smith Dye, one of the founding fathers of the United States Secret Service. His book, History of the Plots and Crimes of the Great Conspiracy to Overthrow Liberty in America, a title which matches the magnitude of his book. In this book, he provides remarkable evidence indicating that in 1841, President William Henry Harrison, who was actively opposing the plans of Young America to expand American territory for conspiratorial purposes, died shortly after entering office of a sudden and unexpected illness. John Smith Dye in this book provides evidence of attending physicians which strongly suggested that he was poisoned. President Zachary Taylor, a hero of the Mexican War, also opposed the plans of Young America, and he died shortly after entering office of a sudden and dramatic unexpected illness. The testimony of his attending physicians is also given in this book, strongly indicating the fact that he was poisoned by his conspiratorial enemies. In 1857, immediately prior to the Lincoln administration, President James Buchanan at first hesitated to support the plans of the secessionists and their plans, which were being modified, of course, by that time. And he and a number of northern politicians at a Washington, D.C. Hotel luncheon all were poisoned on the same day. Interestingly enough, all of the southern politicians attending that luncheon, none of those people were poisoned. 20 people died who attended this luncheon, and the president was taken seriously ill but managed to recover. After that happened, his policies were much more amenable and cooperative with the conspiracy's plans. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that the thesis that the Knights of the Golden Circle were responsible for creating the Confederacy, imposing it upon the people of the South, starting a war that really no one wanted and which was certainly not necessary and quite avoidable, this thesis was the accepted interpretation of what caused the Civil War, at least throughout most of the North, up until the early decades, or the turn of the 20th century, when so many socialist and left-leaning educators began rewriting American history books. This thesis was well published and accepted, of course, isolated from the context of its Illuminist European roots, but still quite well accepted. And I was amazed to see, coming back from the Midwest or from Texas in 1983 on Southwest Airlines, that their flight magazine had published an article on how the Knights of the Golden Circle started the Civil War, as General Bickley boasted, by creating secession in the state of Texas. So I would say that if this thesis is uncontroversial sufficiently to appear as a popular essay in an in-flight magazine, perhaps what we're talking about has been overlooked, but it's certainly not that controversial. Tsar Alexander II was probably the greatest leader of Russia and one of the greatest statesmen throughout the world during the 19th century. He, of course, is the Tsar who freed the serfs in his country in 1861, 4 years before the slaves were freed in the United States. He also, by providing Russian ships to New York and San Francisco harbors, assisted mightily with Lincoln's successful defeat of the rebellion by allowing Lincoln to take all available naval vessels down to small-sized boats and wage the successful blockade of the South. Alexander II was a target of the Illuminists for assassination. In 1866, 1 year to the day after President Lincoln was assassinated, there was an attempt on the life of Alexander II, which was unsuccessful. About 20 years later, they finally managed to kill him. You see a woodcut here of the assassination of Alexander II. A driver, he was in a coach, and an attack was made upon the driver. He got out of the coach to assist the wounded man, and a second attack was fatal to Tsar Alexander II. Other incidents of significance at this time: in 1881, President James Garfield was assassinated by Charles Guiteau. We happen to know that Charles Guiteau was an illuminist of sorts, who was an initiate and attendee of several of the utopian socialist communities, which were first formed in the United States by agents of the European Illuminati with the assistance of the Marquis de Lafayette in the 1820s, and such people as Charles Dana and Francis Wright. In 1886, on May 4th, one of the great incidents of urban terrorism, one of the early textbook strategy practice sessions, the Haymarket Square bombing in Chicago, was perpetrated by Illuminist agents affiliated with the European Anarchist Network directed by Johann Most. We know a great deal about the Haymarket Square bombing, which has become in many ways a historical celebration for the anarchist and socialist left, as a result of the fact that the police chief of Chicago, motivated no doubt by the wounding and death of several of his officers who were killed in the incident, Captain Michael Schack, wrote a monumental history of this event, published a couple of years later, Anarchy and Anarchists, and which is today available in an academic reprint format. 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated by another anarchist agent under control or affiliated with the European Illuminist structure. His name was Leon Czolgosz. As we come into the 20th century, we come into a body of material that is more familiar to contemporary students of the conspiracy thesis. Principally, one of the main sources from which this information has been derived is the work of the late Georgetown professor Carroll Quigley. His book, published in 1966, Tragedy and Hope, an earlier article he wrote for the Canadian Historical Review on the roundtable groups in Canada, his personal correspondence, some of which has been made available, and a subsequent posthumously published book, The Anglo-American Establishment. The work of Carroll Quigley introduced all of us to the existence and functioning of a secret society or circle of initiates formed originally by South African diamond magnate Cecil Rhodes and incorporated or actually instituted in Rhodes' will, where he referred specifically to the formation of a secret society for these purposes. At Oxford University in the 1890s, he was influenced by literary figure John Ruskin to start a movement called the New Imperialism, a movement which after 1880, after 1890, would aggressively have England pursuing aggrandizement or collection of colonial areas that belonged to other European powers, rather than the passive absorption of colonial territory into the British Empire in previous decades. An aggressive new diplomatic posture which was calculated to provoke incidents that could lead to a world war. Affiliated in this round table circle of initiates with Cecil Rhodes was Alfred Lord Milner and a number of other elite British individuals in various walks of life, from nobility to the directorship of the London Times and other principal financial political circles. They were responsible for triggering a number of diplomatic crises, ruptures, and clashes leading up to the outbreak of the European War in 1914. The improbability of this war was known at the time because the British and German monarchs were first cousins, had no reason to be going to war with each other, and it was only a series of such arbitrary diplomatic crises, ruptures, and clashes that could provide an excuse for such a calamity. One of these in 1902 was the Jameson Raid initiated by the Round Table Group in South Africa, which brought England into direct confrontation with Germany, and a series of subsequent events directed by members of the Round Table affiliate groups, notably soon-to-be Prime Minister Edward Grey, provided further excuse for the conflicts and hostilities leading to the war in 1914. Interestingly enough, the Rhodes-Milner Round Table Group, at least in the person of Alfred Lord Milner, were involved in helping the Bolsheviks come to power in Russia in 1917. A British intelligence officer, Bruce Lockhart, in his remarkable autobiography, British Agent, actually speaks of the various personnel hired by him and his associates acting as agents of Alfred Milner to engage in the insurrection aimed at seizure of the Winter Palace Square in the fall 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in St. Petersburg. The continuity of this group with the Illuminati is interesting. The person who was most responsible for introducing Cecil Rhodes to the other members of the early Round Table group was a British journalist, William T. Stead. William Stead was one of the leaders of the Fabian Socialist movement at this time, and the person responsible for directing his activities was Annie Besant. Annie Besant was not only a leader of the Fabian Socialist movement, but she was also the successor to Helena Blavatsky in the Theosophical movement. And Helena Blavatsky, her immediate predecessor, had been a very active agent of Mazzini and the Carbonari, actually fighting in the early years of the Italian unification movement, having been wounded in combat. So there's a direct organizational continuity from the early 19th century Carbonari through the Theosophical movement with the formation and direction of the Rhodes-Milner Round Table group in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century England, and spreading ultimately to the United States. Finally, in 1914, an agent of the Unification or Death, United Slav, or underground Serbian movement assassinated the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Serbia. His name was Gavrilo Princip, the agent conducting the assassination. And this had been predicted in writing in the correspondence of a Swiss Grand Orient Lodge 2 years earlier in 1912. And this was the incident that provided the excuse for Europe going to war in 1914. One of the excellent sources on the manipulation of the First World War by the Illuminati and by its various British and German affiliates and agents was Copan Albancelli's The Occult War. This is a Spanish translation of that book. I think one of the most interesting indications from this period was an admission or statement by one of the losers in that war, German leader Kaiser Wilhelm II. In his memoirs published about 1922, he stated, "I have been informed that an important role was played in the preparation of the World War directed against the monarchical Central Powers by the policy of the International Grand Orient Lodge, a policy extending over many years and always envisaging the goal at which it was aimed." And he was made aware of the fact that the ultimate outcome of the war, the punishment of the German people, the reparations that Germany was forced to pay, the severance and loss of its territorial area, the reduction of its army, the terrible inflation brought upon it, were all designs and plans of the Grand Orient at this time. And for him to admit that in his memoirs after it was all over and done with, I thought was a most remarkable admission. Some of you may be aware from Colin Simpson's excellent history of the sinking of the Lusitania that the United States was brought into the European war quite treacherously by the Wilson administration and with the encouragement of then naval official Winston Churchill as a result of the sinking of the Lusitania and the fact that there were American passengers on board, even though the ship was known to be carrying military contraband and was doing so openly and defiantly in spite of official German warnings that it would constitute a warship and vulnerable to attack. All of this has been very well established, and the Lusitania was a deliberate incident for provocation used by the Wilson administration as an excuse to enter the war. The Wilson administration was from 1912 onward so influenced by these policies as a result of the influence on Wilson of his personal advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House. Colonel House was truly the gray eminence or the Henry Kissinger of the Wilson administration. All of Wilson's foreign and domestic policies were shaped by House, and this is very significant because their relationship was truly remarkable. George Sylvester Viereck, in his book The Strangest Friendship in History, shows that House held a Svengali-like influence on Wilson. He had the amazing ability to plant an idea or policy in Wilson's mind and then convince Wilson that he had thought of it himself. This revolutionary idealism, noted by other scholars and authors on the subject, such as Jennings Wise in his book Woodrow Wilson, Disciple of Revolution, came directly from Colonel House. And Colonel House had written an anonymously authored novel in 1912 called Philip Drew, Administrator, which was a revolutionary plan for the United States. Philip Drew, Administrator, published in 1912, was a revolutionary blueprint for the United States, incorporating many of the planks of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. And it projected a vision of these things being officially implemented as U.S. policy. Why was this? Because Philip Drew, the principal character, obviously modeled after House himself, states in the book that he believed in socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. In the official papers of Colonel House, published after the war and compiled by Charles Seymour, House reveals that Philip Drew largely constituted his political and ethical faith. So this is why, after the war was over, an attempt was made largely by the French Grand Orient, insiders in the British government, and Colonel House and Wilson to implement, in the case of Wilson, as the 14th of the famous 14-point speech that House prepared for him, as well as in the directives of the French Grand Orient, the plan for a solution to World War, a League of Nations, an incipient or framework of world government that would prevent a devastating European war from happening again. It was so out of step with patriotic American feeling that the United States Senate refused to affiliate the United States with the League, and it failed in constituting the goal or structure of world government that the conspiracy had always sought. As a result of this, some plans had to be repeated and strategies had to be revived. In the meantime, the Wilson administration had very effectively assisted with the installation of temporary formal Bolshevik power in the nearby nation of Mexico. Books like Michael Kenny's No God Next Door, Red Rule in Mexico and Our Responsibility, other sources by other authors at the time who were eyewitnesses on the scene, demonstrate very clearly that the early Bolshevik regimes of Carranza and Calles in Mexico, immediately after the end of World War I, were officially installed, supported, and financed by the Wilson administration. And it has been that maintenance of communist and socialist power behind the scenes in formal political life in Mexico has been responsible for the Mexican economy never being able to emerge from the doldrums. Because of the defeat of the League of Nations, the failure of the United States to join, it was necessary to stage another European war within a couple of decades, which would be even more destructive and which would provide an even more compelling excuse for world government. In the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the stage was set. Germany was punished. Germany was given exclusive blame for the war that largely British insider conspiratorial diplomacy had produced. And as a result, Germany was forced to give up much of its territory, reduce its army, and pay huge reparations, plunging that country and its people into a deep depression. As a result, the country was ripe for demagogic politicians to rise on the scene and seek justice and revenge against the Allied governments. These organizations and personalities were cultivated by a series of secret societies that really came directly as continuity directly from the original German Illuminati structure that had formed the basis of the German unification in the 19th century. One of these, in the early years of the 20th century, was called the German Order and was an occult, satanic, mystical, irrational, pseudoscientific group of aesthetic people, philosophers, and mystics. And they had very bizarre, racist, and anti-Semitic theories and very strange mystical practices. Out of this circle came an organization called the Thule Society, and the 7 original leaders of the Thule Society, including Anton Drexler, the recently deceased Rudolf Hess, Dietrich Eckart, the German geopolitician Karl Haushofer, Harrer, and several other personalities. The leading members of the Thule Society were also the 7 founding members of the German Socialist National Workers' Party, or the Nazi movement in Germany. The Nazi movement in Germany, everything from their structure, their organization, their doctrines, and even their newspaper came directly out of the Thule Society. We know something about this from the revelations of Dr. Walter Johannes Stein, who passed away in 1957 and who was very much involved as a consultant for the British government during World War II. He had been a member of the Thule Society and was aware of its influence in the early decades of this century on the formation and control of the Nazi movement. In a book published in the early 70s, The Spear of Destiny, a pupil or disciple, a student of Stein's named Trevor Ravenscroft revealed the fact that that Dr. Stein had been aware of the extent of the Thule Society's control over the creation of the Nazi movement in Germany, and that he had been sworn to secrecy, never to reveal this publicly, by Winston Churchill. Other books documented the Thule Society's creation of the Nazi movement far more convincingly and with far more corroboration. The outstanding one being written by 2 benevolent French occultists writing under the pseudonym Jean-Michel Angebert, the title The Occult in the Third Reich. A number of more recent books, Dusty Sklar's Gods and Beasts, The Nazis and the Occult. Interesting lesser works like Kenneth Walker's testimony as an American enlisted man in World War II, fighting in Germany. He and others claim to have witnessed satanic black mass rites being conducted at Hitler's mountaintop retreats. A more recent work, and some of the best scholarship on this subject, Monsieur Allot's book, Hitler and the Secret Societies, remain untranslated, available only in French, and we hope that we'll be able to translate at least substantial excerpts from them in the future. It brings into sharper focus what Adolf Hitler meant when he spoke to German businessman Hermann Rauschning, who reported this statement. Hitler told Rauschning, among so many other things, "The world must be freed from its historical past. To accomplish this task, the notion of race is most useful. It does away with old ideas and opens possibilities for new combinations. Taking as its starting point the principle of nation, France pushed its great revolution beyond its frontiers. With the notion of race, National Socialism will use its own revolution for the establishing of a new world order," unquote. Now, after the Illuminati was establishing the Nazi movement in Germany in the early decades of this century through the Thule Society and affiliated movements, it was necessary, of course, to put the Nazis in power in that country. This was done in the 1932 election. In that year, there were 3 political factions competing for the chancellorship and the legislative posts in the Reichstag. The parties were a loose confederation of social democrats called the Iron Front, who had the greatest amount of voter support. The party second in significance was the Nazi movement, and the communists were third. Prior to that time, the communists and the Nazi stormtroopers had been fighting it out in the streets as rival socialists seeking power. But in 1932, the German Communist Party received some very strange and unexpected orders directly from Stalin in Moscow. And they were that they were to leave the Nazis alone in that year's election and concentrate all their attacks and physical interference with the campaigns of the Social Democrats. As a result, the Social Democrats were not able to run an efficient election campaign effort that year, and they lost out to the Nazi movement. In this way, as a number of historians have commented, Stalin was able physically to put the Nazis in power in Germany in 1932. One of the best eyewitness accounts of this fact is a blockbuster, best-selling book published in the 1940s in the United States, a monumental literary experience for anyone to read, and a book that's available in most used bookstores, Out of the Night by Richard Krebs, a German communist who managed to escape Germany and come to the United States, served with distinction during World War II in the American Navy, and who wrote this and several other books in the 1940s and 1950s under the pseudonym Jan Valtine. Chapter 24 of Out of the Night tells the story of how, literally, Stalin put Hitler in power in Germany in order to provide an excuse for another European war. It is true that during this time, during the period of 1920 up through 1935, there were a number of conspirators, both in the Soviet government and in the German government, who were examining the possibility of a unified merger, a campaign in which German and Russian conspirators would create some regional world government structure throughout Europe, consolidate power there, and then move that on later after the war was over. One of the best sources of that is a rather rare book by Cecil Melville called The Russian Face of Germany. And it was certainly the influence of this faction and people like the German-Prussian Count Brockdorff-Ransnau, who facilitated, and certainly it was to Stalin's advantage to facilitate, the 1939 Soviet-Nazi Non-Aggression Pact and Alliance, which was preparing and setting the stage for the second World War, second war necessary for justifying world government. Of course, in 1939, after the signing of the pact, Germany and Russia both invaded Poland, and this provided an excuse for beginning the war. You're looking at a picture here of a gentleman named Tyler Kent. Tyler Kent was an American code clerk at the American Embassy in London in 1939. He began to notice in the cabled coded messages he was translating, he began to notice that communication correspondence was going on between President Franklin Roosevelt and then former member of Parliament and former naval official but private citizen Winston Churchill. In the early fall of 1939, in the American Embassy in London, communications were examined by Tyler Kent in which Churchill was saying, in effect, to President Roosevelt, "I am half American. I'm the natural one to work with you. Together we can control the world." Tyler Kent didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that politicians in England and America were aggressively pushing for entrance into the war and for avoiding any peaceful revision of the harsh Versailles Treaty terms that were imposed on Germany after World War I. So he took these cabled messages to a number of prominent military officials in England who were served with distinction and were highly decorated from World War I. They took those messages and that information to then Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in an effort to prevent the war from getting underway. When this happened, Tyler Kent and a number of these military officers were arrested and put in prison in England, in the case of Tyler Kent, in violation of diplomatic immunity for the duration of the war. And his effort, just like the flight of Rudolf Hess in 1941 to Britain to make a separate peace, certainly an action on the part of Hess, who was in a position to know what had actually occurred and what had gone on, and something that the Soviets never forgave Hess for right up until the time of his death by keeping him imprisoned. These were efforts to stop the war from getting underway or from continuing, which were not to be allowed. Of course, by 1940, when Churchill had become Prime Minister, England began bombing unarmed civilian territories in Germany before any German bombing of Britain. There is interesting information, ladies and gentlemen, on this subject in a number of books, including John Toland's outstanding book on Pearl Harbor and the way the Roosevelt administration had positioned the American fleet at Hawaii for the purpose of encouraging the Japanese attack and providing an excuse for American entry in the war on Stalin's side. In Toland's book, he provides information on Tyler Kent, but a work that is now out of print by John Howland Snow, The Case of Tyler Kent, is probably the best single publication on that subject. This is a man named Lord Halifax, who was a British foreign minister in 1939 and who assisted Churchill very much in the diplomatic triggering of the European war. At the time of the Russo-German alliance and the invasion of Poland, Halifax was making a series of trips. First, he would go to Germany and he would say to Hitler, yes, we think the Versailles Treaty should be revised. Yes, we think you should be able to have a corridor through Poland. The German city in Poland of Danzig should be under German administration, and you should be able to get some of the territory back that was stolen from Germany at the end of World War I. So in effect, he gave Hitler the indication of a green light for Hitler's attempt to revise the Versailles Treaty. At the same time, he was making simultaneous trips to Poland and telling the Polish leaders, stand firm, resist anything that Hitler tries to do to revise the Versailles Treaty. Don't give in an inch, we'll back you to the limit. So he was deliberately setting up Poland to provide itself as an excuse for the invasion of Poland, as an excuse for triggering the European war. In addition to the book The Enforced War by David Hagen, which has never been translated into English, in addition to A.J.P. Taylor's quite satisfactory The Origins of the Second World War, the very best historical coverage of this period is given in the works of the British historian Francis Nielsen. Several of his books are invaluable, even though they're very difficult to obtain today. I hope they will be more extensively excerpted and reprinted in the future. One of them is The Churchill Legend, which is the equivalent on Winston Churchill to Robert Welch's book, The Politician, on Dwight Eisenhower. Nielsen's other books included a daily diary of World War II, a 5-volume master work called The Tragedy of Europe, a book on World War I, one of the most important ones on Edward Gray's diplomatic troublemaking, which led to the war, How Diplomats Make War, and an excellent survey summary on World War II and British diplomacy, The Makers of War. After Hitler was in power, after the war was underway, after the United States was brought into the war artificially through the Pearl Harbor deception, Hitler had served his purpose, and now it was only necessary to bring the war to an end and collect the spoils. This was done, that is, the arbitrary or the designed, contrived defeat of Germany was guaranteed by the fact that surrounding Hitler were not only Illuminist Luciferians and Satanists in the Black Order or the German Order, the Thule Society, but also another level of the conspiracy. Another number of Stalin's agents were among his most trusted lieutenants. And some of these people were providing Hitler with false military information and also providing Stalin with information through intermediary agents like Alexander Foote. You see him pictured here. He's one of the principal players in the conspiracy recounted in the incident in the book A Man Called Lucy. He and Rudolf Roessler and others were carrying information back and forth from the agents around Hitler to Joseph Stalin. Some of these people may have included in Hitler's high command the head of naval intelligence, Admiral Canaris, Martin Bormann, certainly Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, Alfred Rosenberg, both of the latter two being leaders of the Black Order, the German Order, the Thule Society, and a number of others. During the Nuremberg trials, it came out that the strategy of this group of Soviet agents was to bring about Germany's defeat in the war by representing to Hitler and to the German command that England was quite prepared to repulse an invasion in 1941 at a time when there were only 8 anti-aircraft batteries for the entire defense of London. At the same time, they convinced Hitler that Soviet Russia in 1941 was unable to defend itself for more than a few weeks. And since Stalin was giving this disinformation, was aware of this communication, he had the western borders of Russia quite well fortified. But by this means, Hitler was tricked into invading Russia, and the conspiracy thought that this would quickly produce the defeat of Germany. They didn't, I suppose, count on the fact that the Russian people initially welcomed the German armies as liberators for themselves to liberate them from communism. And they put down their weapons, they offered no resistance, and they welcomed the German army and hoped that they would free them from communism. This was not the purpose. The purpose was to bring about the defeat of Germany. So leadership of the SS, which was quite a separate administration under conspiracy direction in the Third Reich, leaders of the SS among the troops invading Russia began to place Russian citizens into forced labor battalions, inflicted corporal punishment, and very brutal measures which soon convinced the Russian people that their new liberators were no worse than their prior captors, and of course galvanized some resistance on the part of the Russian people. By this means, of course, Germany was defeated, and at the end of the war, in the advent of nuclear weapons, a new precedent was established, and that was that if there was ever to be another war in the future, it would be so terrible, so destructive, it could perhaps destroy the entire world, that it was most necessary at this point to establish a framework or housing for world government, namely the United Nations, strongly under Soviet influence and the influence the Soviet underground operated through the American diplomatic community that helped to form the United Nations. This would be the framework or housing of a world government that would guarantee such a destructive event would never occur in the future. And hence the United States was pressured and persuaded into joining this new formative world government organization. After the war, the conspiracy managed to implement its power in Europe by trying to destroy personally as many of their anti-communist opponents. This happened in Italy, it happened in France, it happened in Germany. All of the so-called denazification efforts were largely directed by communist agents, some of whom had been Nazi officials and Nazi party members during the war, suddenly switched sides and became communists after the war and administered the persecution of their own former associates, and also the purge of simple anti-communists in these countries who would have opposed their plans. Now we want to discuss the fact that since the beginning of the conspiracy, it has always had a leadership motivated by a satanic idealism. The conspiracy has always been roughly divided into two levels of operation. People who carry out its plans, goals, and directions we would call activists, and these people are motivated by a variety of different goals and reasons for what they're doing, whether it be political advantage, personal wealth, satisfaction of ideological goals, a whole variety of different reasons. These are the people who are visible in world events, in revolutionary movements, in political, banking, financial circles, and the ones who carry out the goals and activities. But above that level, from the beginning, there has always been a hierarchy, what we might call an authority level. And the authority level is responsible for long-term planning and communication and direction of the trends and strategies, communicating these to the acting agents or activists who will carry them out. And this level at the top has always been formally Satanist in its motivation and direction. As I said, Madame Blavatsky fought with Garibaldi in the Italian unification campaign. She formed the Theosophical movement. It was later headed by Annie Besant, and Annie Besant was responsible for influencing William Stead, who put the Round Table group together for Cecil Rhodes at Oxford. We know a great deal about this collection of people because of the writings of René Guénon, the official history of the Theosophical movement, unfortunately only available in French, and also Annie Besant's own extensive writings for the Fabian Socialist movement have been published in academic reprint format. If you wanted to get a picture of the satanic authority level and its repulsive diabolical practices, two novels written at the end of the 19th century in France by Joris Karl Huysmans, particularly his novel Le Bas, actually are believed by historians to be eyewitness recreations of the Black Mass rites and ceremonies of this satanic leadership. In France, the top level of the Illuminati authority level at the end of the 19th century was administered by the leaders of the Grand Orient Freemasonic lodges, the Martinist movement, led by Adolphe Louis Constant, who called himself Eliphas Levi. This is a study by Christopher McIntosh, rather sympathetic study in recent years that provides a lot of detail about their activities and influence on political circles. The Bolshevik Revolution occurred in the fall of 1917. In February of that year, the Social Democratic, or Kerensky Revolution occurred, which was the first overthrow of the Tsar, and of course which was undermined and usurped by the Bolsheviks later that year. But George Katkov, in his very important mainstream historical work, February 1917, showed that even the Kerensky revolt in Russia was largely directed by Russian agents of Illuminist Grand Orient Freemasonic lodges. At the end of the 19th century, the authority level in England largely constituted itself within organizations known as the Society Rosicruciana in Anglia or the Golden Dawn. The most notorious Satanist in this circle was Aleister Crowley, who provided a link from the late 19th century satanic authority level into the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century. He referred to himself as the leader of the Illuminati in the United States. And from a reading of his confessions and memoirs, he had influence in very high places. The leader of the Golden Dawn in England was Samuel Liddell McGregor Mathers. This is probably the only known photograph of him. Some of the influential people in England who fell into this satanic circle included the celebrated British poet William Butler Yeats. A look into the records of the Golden Dawn provides us with another interesting answer to a question that frequently arises. You're looking at a picture of a London coroner, William Wynne Westcott, who was one of the leaders of the Golden Dawn, or the Society Rosicruciana in Anglia. He was one of the leaders of its inner circle. And the question has often come up, how does the Illuminati at this top level, the authority level, prevent people in their own circle from leaking this information to the public? Why have there been so few confessions by members of inner circle initiates? He was asked that one time, and he wrote this as his answer. It might be asked how it is that the order's secrets have not been revealed, either by accident or treachery. As to the first hypothesis, I have only heard of some of the contents of 2 manuscripts escaping from the order. One copy is so elementary as to be practically useless, and moreover is full of errors. The other has been so perverted as to be simply dangerous to the user. Doubtless the higher chiefs take means for removing any important manuscript from those they see about to be incapacitated by illness or death. As for treachery, it is not likely that any very important secrets would be given to a member until his fidelity was thoroughly assured. And every initiate of an occult order knows that his willful perjury would be followed by unpleasant consequences, possibly a coroner's inquest, unquote. Also at this period of time, we see direct communication between the German authority level, the Ordo Templi Orientis, and its leader Theodor Reuss, communication between this level, this German-based level of the Satanic Authority Directorate, and William Wynne Westcott in the English level. Does the Golden Dawn in this early 20th century Satanic Authority level still exist today? It probably does. As recently as 20 years ago, Golden Dawn regalia and costuming and ritual ceremony indication was found at a public place in England. This book was published in 1924 in France, showing the influence of the French Grand Orient in the early decades of this century. The book simply reviewed statements and policy directives of the Grand Orient and shown how a captive French government immediately instituted those policies after they were issued by the Grand Orient. And the best research on the occult satanic level of the conspiracy in recent decades has been conducted by French scholars, principally under the leadership of Henri Caston and La Librairie Française. They have published a number of books on the influence of the Grand Orient in world politics, in particular in France, and also on an affiliated occult movement called the Synergy of Agartha, or the Technocratic Movement. This is a movement that was formed by an obscure literary figure at the beginning of the 20th century, Saint Yves Delvedre, whose writings projected the goal of regional and eventually consolidated world government structures to be formed first on a continental basis and then throughout the rest of the world. One interesting anecdote that I noticed was the fact that in 1949, the Synergy of Agartha, an official representative of it, wrote a letter of praise and commendation to the president of Columbia University at that time, praising his war record, praising his statesmanlike demeanor, and in effect welcoming him into their circle. His name was Dwight David Eisenhower. We don't know, we don't have any published response on his part, but we think the invitation is quite interesting. The best books on the Seinershi and its influence have been published in France, and we hope that we can translate substantial excerpts from them and publish them in the United States in English in the near future. If you're interested in reading about this occult satanic hierarchy, although from a source that is much more sympathetic in tone, the expensive but quite detailed works of historian James Webb, The Occult Underground, and The Occult Establishment are worth examination. An earlier study by Mildred Headings, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, detailed the influence of the Grand Orient in France up through the end of World War II. And this is an extremely detailed scholarly work which shows that France's political life was totally shaped by the Grand Orient into the mid-decades of this century. You're looking at a picture of Fred Zeller, an obscure modern French painter who until recently was the president of the French Grand Orient. I know it may seem surprising, but you're looking at one of the leaders of the satanic authority level of the master conspiracy, not exactly a public name that people in the United States would recognize, which underscores the fact that the occult satanic level are not the political, financial, ideological activists whom we see so prominent in day-to-day events. They're often behind the scenes. They're not public names except in a very obscure way, but they are responsible for formulating and communicating these patterns to the activists who, for their own benefit and goals, carry them out. Rarely do we see a case history of the relationship between the satanic authority level and other levels of the conspiracy with which we are more familiar, such as the Soviet hierarchy. But one outstanding example, one case history of this, was the P2 Lodge, or the Propaganda du Lodge scandal of the last 5 to 7 years in Italy. The P2 Lodge is a secret lodge of Italian Freemasonry, of Italian Grand Orient Freemasonry, in fact, and the P2 Lodge and its members were very influential in Italian politics and financial circles with ramifications around the globe. One of these was a man named Roberto Calvi. He was head of the Banco Ambrosiano, which was the Vatican's bank, and which worked very closely with the Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who was the official director of the Vatican Bank. The Banco Ambrosiano was closely affiliated with the Catholic Church. As a result of the exposure of the P2 Lodge, its influence and criminal conduct in those banking circles, Calvi was found hanged in London. The day he was hanged, his secretary was pushed or fell through a window of the bank. Another official of the bank was pushed or fell from another window a few months later. The editor of Observatore Politico of Rome sent Pope John Paul I, the predecessor to the current pope, sent Pope John Paul I a list of P2 initiates within the Vatican. The Pope died under mysterious circumstances, and David Yallop, in his book In God's Name, tries to make a case that the P2 Lodge was responsible for assassinating Pope John Paul I. The Pope died under mysterious circumstances a couple of days after receiving that list and was buried without a medical certificate ever being shown by the Vatican. He was embalmed, making a future autopsy impossible. The editor of Observatore Politico, who sent his list of P2 Lodge members in the Vatican, was shot down by machine gun on the streets of Rome a few days later. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal had ramifications, including the fall of the Franklin National Bank, one of the first of bank failures in recent years in the United States. And the scandal, to settle the financial ramifications of the scandal, in 1984, the Vatican had to pay a settlement of $250 million. All of this information was somewhat confusing until the publication several years ago of a most important book by Stephen Knight called The Brotherhood. Most of this book is on the cultural life and influence of British Freemasonry and is not relevant to our discussion. But the last several chapters of the book provide crucial primary intelligence information, which shows that the P2 Lodge in Italy was not, as previous commentators and theorists had propounded, was not a right-wing anti-communist movement, but was actually a front initiated a joint project with the Soviet KGB. And so here we had very strong first-hand indication in Stephen Knight's book, and I'm very sorry to say that Stephen Knight also passed away at a very young age. It may strictly be a coincidence. In his book, The Brotherhood, we have one of the first clear cases, in recent years that is, of an active working relationship between the satanic authority level of Grand Orient Freemasonry with the communist apparatus in the KGB worldwide. And it is an extremely significant case history. One of the most interesting indications of the source of recent foreign policy, the strategy of managed limited warfare, of continued manipulated diplomatic crises in various parts of the world, of the United States using its taxpayers' money to build and strengthen the technology and military might of the Soviet Union, all of which brings us to the point of potential armed conflict with our adversaries around the world because we financed them, propped them up, strengthened them, and kept them in power. The source of this foreign policy, I think, was very well revealed in an incident that I had a chance to describe in detail in my book on the tax-exempt foundations. In 1953, a committee in the House of Representatives was investigating a number of tax-exempt foundations, notably the Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie foundations, because many of these had been involved in, frankly, partisan political activities and promotion of totalitarian and left-wing causes. A representative of the Congressional Committee went to the then president of the Ford Foundation, Rowan Gaither, explained the purpose of the investigation, and requested an explanation for a number of grants and practices of the Ford Foundation at that time, 1953. And in answer to the questions of Norman Dodd, Ford Foundation President Rowan Gaither made this statement. Most of us here were, at one time or another, active in either the OSS, the State Department, or the European Economic Administration. During those times, and without exception, we operated under directives issued by the White House, the substance of which was to the effect that we should make every effort to so alter life in the United States as to make possible a comfortable merger with the Soviet Union. We are continuing to be guided by just such directives. Well, of course, Norman Dodd, as a representative of the Congressional Committee, was totally surprised to hear this statement. He said, well, save us the trouble of the investigation, just come out publicly and admit that. And Rowan Gaither said, this we would not think of doing. And I think there's no more succinct case history or indication that gives us a way of understanding subsequent U.S. foreign policy in recent decades. Another topic that indicates, there are a couple of other topics that indicate two major strategies of the conspiracy. One, the infiltration and destruction of organized religious institutions. This is a book published in France about 1910, over 300 pages of small print showing the infiltration of the Catholic Church by Grand Orient Freemasons and leftists by that time, an extreme amount. Subsequent books written in recent years provide far more detail. But the infiltration of the Catholic Church has been a long and continuous process. Very important for the conspiracy because during the 19th century, particularly in Europe, the Catholic Church, as well as the nation of Austria under Metternich, provided the most articulate, informed, and strong opposition to the expansion and success of the conspiracy's plans. A recent book which indicates the perversion and use of departments of the Catholic Church, such as the Jesuit order, which were, during the 19th century and early 20th century, the leading opponents of the conspiracy, into effective destroyers of the Catholic Church itself, is Malachi Martin's book, The Jesuits, subtitled The Society of Jesus and the Betrayal of the Roman Catholic Church. An example of the infiltration of Protestant churches in the United States, one of the most infamous examples, is that of Galion, Ohio Episcopal priest and admitted communist William Montgomery Brown. And Bishop Brown was, of course, expelled from the Episcopal Church for his open, avowed communism. He wrote a number of books espousing communism, and he is respected and highlighted in the Soviet Union today as a hero among Protestant clergymen in the United States. Many people who are familiar with the history of the National and World Council of Churches are aware of the influence of the communist conspiracy in the Protestant community in the United States. A related subject is the conspiracy's use of racism and anti-Semitism as a weapon of destruction. All the way back to the writings of Karl Marx, which spoke so critically, derisively of the economic influence of entrepreneurial Jewish communities in Europe and the need to eradicate that influence, up to more contemporary works that are extremely important. Ben Hecht's very important, or almost invaluable book, Perfidy, which talks about the fact that the Zionist movement is not a unified, holistic, homogeneous movement, but really composed of two separate warring movements. One is genuinely Jewish, pro-American, anti-communist, pro-free enterprise. That's the Herut Zvi Leumi, or the Menachem Begin faction, the Zionist revisionist movement of Jabotinsky, the real founders of the State of Israel, who were almost destroyed physically by a combination of British socialists and the phony division of Zionism, the Labor Party in Israel, which unfortunately has been in power most of the time since the formation of the State of Israel in 1947 and has destroyed, or substantially destroyed, that country's economy. Another very important book on the subject is Rabbi Marvin Antelman's To Eliminate the Opiate, which traces the conspiracy's efforts to destroy Orthodox Jewish faith all the way back to the time of the Illuminati and forward, and the creation of phony heretical movements in the Jewish community which would undermine, water down, and destroy Orthodox Jewish faith in a very similar manner to the discrediting and destruction of traditional Catholic and Protestant faith by conspirators in their midst. My book in 1975, Clandestine, gave the case history of a man named Delmar Dennis, who was the FBI's most important undercover operative in the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi from 1964 to 67. He was the principal government agent who managed to provide the testimony which convicted the men, the Klan leaders and members responsible for the killing of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964. He found out something most interesting, and that was that the leader of this Klan group, the man who went to federal prison for ordering the crimes, Sam Holloway Bowers, Jr., admitted to his leadership in 1964, but never to the members, that he had planned, he was carrying out all of this violence against black people in Mississippi because he wanted to create a situation of racial crisis and turmoil sufficient to justify the federal government coming into Mississippi to impose a solution of federal control to solve the chaos he was causing, or in other words, the old strategy of revolutionary parliamentarianism, pressure from above and pressure from below. When his lieutenants asked him about where he learned this strategy, he said that he learned the strategy he was carrying out in Mississippi through the Ku Klux Klan in 1947 at USC in Los Angeles, when he said he first joined the Communist Party. Before my book went to print, I found some amazing corroboration for that, about the activity of the communists creating racial hatred and anti-Semitic incidents at USC in 1947. A very important recent book, one of the most important of the last decade, is the book by Soviet defector and former KGB operative Anatoly Golitsyn, New Lies for Old. Golitsyn was one of 3 Soviet defectors who revealed Soviet penetration of Western intelligence services, including the CIA. And this book is unbelievably important in exposing Soviet disinformation strategies, principally the phony supposed split between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia in the 1950s, and the supposed split, actually phony rift, between the Soviet Union and Red China in recent years, and the way that supposed rift or split or opposition is used to benefit communist purposes. There is no more important book on Soviet disinformation than Golitsyn's. Another very important book I recommend is Henry Pike's History of Communism in South Africa. It not only gives you the information about the current communist terrorist onslaught against that country and its strategic importance to the West, but it also shows you that the Marxist movement has been operating most comprehensively in South Africa since the 1850s through the labor movement, and it gives you an incredibly detailed history of that period of time. All of this study has to have some personal inspiration. All of this compilation material that I've been through has to have been guided by personal inspiration. And that personal inspiration for me was a man named Bill Highsmith, who was major coordinator of the John Birch Society for the southeastern United States from the early 1960s to his death in 1976. He is the very rare individual who helped me so much in beginning my research, and it was due to his personal guidance and influence on my life, as well as the example of Robert Welch for both of us, that I and the late Larry McDonald and a number of other people benefited so greatly. And so I have the memory of my dear friend Bill Highsmith to be most thankful for guiding me in this research and collection of information. The question naturally arises, what can be done once this information is sufficiently realized? Because we're dealing with a conspiracy, we realize correctly that the only thing that can be done effectively is to expose the nature and strategies of the conspiracy. This does not mean that everyone in the United States needs to know the detailed history which we've only briefly summarized in this lecture. But it is important that they be aware of the existence of a conspiracy and some of its major strategies so that they will not fall victim to misunderstanding them or doing something very destructive as a result of being deceived by those strategies. And that can only be accomplished through sufficient understanding through an educational movement uniquely exemplified by the John Birch Society. As a member of the John Birch Society since 1965, I've been able to see my efforts and activities produce solid results. This is because the John Birch Society not only has the proper analysis of the problem, realizes that this is a historical conspiratorial movement, has the courage to say so, and has the resources to document and communicate that information on a grassroots level to the public. It also has been effective for me because the John Birch Society has provided the only consistent, comprehensive, grassroots action program that all of its members could, in a unified way, be carrying out around the country at the same time. Most effective in this area, in addition to educational activities, has been pressure mounted from the grassroots level on the House of Representatives, most effectively since the early 1970s. Why the House of Representatives? Because the United States government, its domestic and foreign policies, particularly its foreign policy and foreign aid support of other nations, has been a crucial instrument in implementing the further world government strategies and approach to warfare strategies, foreign policy strategy of this conspiracy. If we wish to block that sort of strategy, we have to stop those programs, both foreign and domestic. The way to do that is to realize that all government programs are funded by the House of Representatives, which originates all spending bills and all tax bills. If the executive branch, if the president in office, whoever he may be, has a good policy, has a bad policy, wants to carry something out, he still has to convince Congress to pay for it. It's much easier to influence the House of Representatives, and the John Birch Society, through organized monthly letter-writing campaigns and through the publication of congressional voting records, which are distributed door-to-door to constituents in congressional districts across the country every 90 days through an activity called the TRIM, or Tax Reform Immediately Committees. These are uniquely effective approaches. They allow the citizens to be aware of how their representatives have been voting, and as those politicians which wish to get reelected every 2 years, they all seem to want to be reelected, it looks like. When that comes up, they're able to put pressure on them by exposing, publishing their voting records, and encouraging people to write letters to them. In short, the John Birch Society has the understanding, the awareness of the nature of this evil enemy, the conspiratorial explanation, the resources, the grassroots organizational structure, the experience, and most of all, the proper, proven, successful strategy for effectively opposing, exposing, and destroying this conspiracy before it's ultimately successful. Has a proven track record of success in carrying out that opposition. That means, in short, that once you accept the reality of the master conspiracy thesis, a moral obligation is presented to you. And that is that if you want to see yourself effective in doing something to expose and destroy this movement, to preserve an opportunity for some freedom in your future and that of your loved ones, you have no other realistic alternative today, in addition to understanding the nature of the enemy, than to become very active and effectively so in the programs and activities of the John Birch Society. That's your first obligation. That's the first responsibility, opposing this evil as it's manifest today and making more and more people aware of it. And the John Birch Society is uniquely, I would say exclusively, able to make you effective in that endeavor. If you are interested in studying the history of the conspiracy and becoming aware or having access to the information, the primary source documents that are available beyond the material that happens to be in print today, there is another opportunity I would like to share with you, and that is an organization I formed in 1986 called the Individualist Research Foundation. This is a tax-exempt foundation designed to make available primary historical documentation on the historical and philosophical background of the material that we presented today. The IRF does not concern itself with any present-day political controversies or partisan political activity or legislative lobbying, but we are concerned with historical presentation, and we're making available this information in live extended seminars. The lecture today was a condensation of a 7 to 8 hour lecture presentation that we have made on this subject. We're also making this available in audio and videotape format in terms of the full-length evidence of a master conspiracy seminar that we've introduced the material for today. Also in the form of a Journal of Individualist Studies, which will be a quarterly journal actually reprinting, translating, and excerpting the original primary source documentation for this 200-year history. If you wish to have that available, if you wish to have access to it, or if you're interested in contributing this information to private schools so they can make it part of their curriculum and alternative bibliographical resources, we welcome your input, support, and interest in the Individualist Research Foundation at the address that will be given on the end of this tape. I want to thank all of you for being here today. I hope you will have a renewed desire to understand this conspiracy better and to be most effective in opposing and destroying it. Thank you so much.